recently honoured with a doctorate from NUI for her work in addressing sexual violence. One of the youngest to ever receive this, I might add. Please welcome activist, writer, author of The Dark Chapter, winner Winnie M Li.
As you can tell from my accent, I am not from Ireland. I'm Taiwanese American, and I grew up in New Jersey, bizarrely obsessed with Ireland. For some reason, all I wanted to do was write and tell stories, so I read every single book on Irish folktales that I could get my hands on. And when I got to university, I studied folklore and mythology with a specialization in Celtic languages and literature. And eventually I was offered a George Mitchell Fellowship to come here to study, so I was thrilled to earn my master's in gender and sexuality in Irish writing. But none of that familiarity with Ireland would prepare me for something which happened unexpectedly 10 years ago on a spring afternoon. Something which unexpectedly would change the course of my life. It was April 2008, and I was hiking in a park on the western edges of Belfast. It was the tail end of a business trip to Northern Ireland, and there was a specific trail in my Lonely Planet guidebook which I wanted to hike. Just 10 minutes into my walk, I was approached by a teenage boy who said he was lost and needed directions. We had a bizarre conversation, and then we parted ways, or at least I thought we had. But little to my knowledge, that Irish teenager kept following me. When I look back on those moments now, I often wonder why I didn't see what I was walking into, how I could have been so caught up in the landscape around me or the trail I was following that I was blind to the danger that boy posed. But that's the thing about rape. You never think it'll happen to you. You're so unaware of how quickly a situation can change from one which seems normal, me hiking on my own one spring afternoon, or a woman stepping into a room with a person she trusts, to a situation that's suddenly threatening. So when I reached a much more remote part of that park with no one else around, that boy approached me one more time. And this time, he was very violent. There were racist slurs shouted at me during my rape, and according to the police report, I had 39 separate injuries after the assaults. Bruises, cuts, and scrapes all up and down my body. But those healed within weeks. The real damage was psychological. I had severe post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, flashbacks, panic attacks. I couldn't step out of my apartment without suffering from agoraphobia. I had trouble trusting people because I'd just been raped by a 15-year-old boy. I never wanted to set foot in Ireland again. And I felt like a fragile, useless shell of the person I'd once been. So just like that, my life changed, suddenly and irreversibly. I went from being normal Winnie, who had an exciting career, who loved traveling, to being another statistic in the police records. The unnamed Chinese tourist brutally raped in park, according to the news headlines that week. In my condition, I was unable to work. I was unemployed for 2.5 years. I lived off of incapacity benefit, and I never regained the career trajectory I had before my assaults. Now, people often think, I often describe it as being forced to cross a border, right? An invisible border I had my life and I thought it was going to go this way, and suddenly, somehow, I was pushed over this border into completely unknown, terrifying, and new territory. And I think inside this room, many of us are aware of the impact of sexual violence on an individual's life. But outside, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding. And this often leads to victim-blaming comments suggesting that a woman got what she deserved for her poor decisions or her bad behavior. She should have known better. What was she doing, flirting with that guy, or getting married to that guy, or drinking so much that evening, or hiking on her own? It's hard to grasp in this day and age when we're all supposed to be empowered, responsible individuals, that something that bad can happen to us through no fault of our own. That someone else can push us over that invisible border, and we have to spend years of our life recovering. Now, I've been calling it an invisible border because it's one that a person may have crossed without others necessarily knowing. If you met me on the street or at a cocktail party, you might not guess that I'm a rape survivor. But we know the statistics. We know at least 1 in 5 women will experience sexual violence. But when you walk into a room, you don't know which one of those women is the 1 in 5. That is the hidden nature of sexual violence. That even though there's so many of us who suffer from these crimes, we rarely speak openly about it, and it's difficult for us to find the support we need. So why don't we speak more openly about rape and sexual assault? Well, I think it has to do with shame, a perceived sense of shame that society projects upon us. We've been raped, therefore we must be ashamed. But why should we be ashamed of something which was never our fault to begin with? The very definition of sexual assault is that it did not involve our consent, so we had nothing to do with it. We just happened to cross paths with the predator. And that's the shift in thinking I had to adopt in order to do the work I do now. I had to stop caring what other people thought once I heard about my rape, whether they felt sorry for me or felt pity for me or thought it was stupid to go hiking on my own. I had to stop caring because I know in the end that I did nothing wrong. And I'm not ashamed of something another person chose to do to me. That shame is for him and him alone. Now, in the past year, our society has undergone a very public reckoning around issues of rape and sexual assault and sexual harassment. And in this Me Too moment, we've been flooded with stories from women and from men. And I think by realizing there's so many victims out there, we're also starting to dismantle that construction of shame which previously kept our stories so hidden and so trapped. We're also starting to publicly recognize the spectrum of misogynistic behavior out there in this world, from crude comments on the street or workplace to coercive relationships to physical violence like what I experienced. These are all interlinked. A perpetrator may start with milder forms of aggression, and if left unchecked, that can progress to physical violence, rape, or even murder. I know my 15-year-old perpetrator would not have gone from 0 to randomly attacking a complete stranger. There would have been previous victims of his aggression. And likewise, as women and girls, we're on the receiving end of a whole range of dehumanizing behaviors: coercion, groping, gaslighting, all of which collectively chip away at our sense of self-worth. So in this new post-Me Too landscape, we have the chance to reevaluate the way our society thinks and speaks about sexual violence. Often when you hear about stories like mine, they're reported as a criminal justice matter. Will the perpetrators be caught or receive a suitable penalty? Are they really perpetrators anyway, or are they just being wrongfully accused? But where are the stories of the victims, of all those lives which have been impacted by the actions of that perpetrator? Just think of the survivors in this room and our stories. I'm often struck by how little the lived reality of sexual violence appears in the media. And by that, I mean the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression, the diminished capacity which can impact all aspects of a victim's life, from self-esteem and mental well-being to career and finances, to relationships and family. If you look at the indelible impact that these crimes have on an individual life, and if you compound that number of lives across a population, it's clear that sexual violence is more than just a criminal justice concern. It's a public health concern. I lost a good 4 years of my adult life recovering from my rape, and my recovery was fairly swift. Just think of how many other years across how many other lives have also been spent trying to find their way back across that border. So let's reframe the way we think about sexual violence. Convicting perpetrators is one essential part of the equation, but sexual violence is about public health. Let's think of all the lives out there which have been affected and all the resources which need to go towards helping those lives recover, so that instead of being diminished and depleted, those lives, which make up a significant swathe of our society, those lives can regain their full potential. We can measure the health of a society about how honest we can be with each other, how empathetic and understanding. And if we cannot be open about the crimes which have damaged us, then our entire society suffers. Because the more we stay silent, the more assaults will go unreported and unconvicted, and the more perpetrators will be able to get away with their behavior and assault again and abuse again and impact the lives of yet more victims. But the burden should never rest on the individual victim. As a society, we need to create an environment that listens and believes and supports survivors. Now, people often ask me, well, what happened to the boy, my 15-year-old rapist? Well, he was caught and convicted. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and he served 4, and he's out now. I think he's up in Belfast somewhere. And in my case, that one individual who single-handedly changed the course of my life will always remain a stranger to me. But I decided to take the idea of that person, my 15-year-old rapist, and turn him into a main character in my first novel, Dark Chapter. I wanted to imagine what had happened in his 15 years of living that had led him to committing the crime that then went on to fundamentally change the course of my life. Because unless we're willing to consider the roots of that behavior, we'll never be able to stop it from happening again. Now remember, writing had always been important to me since childhood. It also became my lifeline out of that trauma. In the process of writing my novel, I came back to Ireland to research for the book, and I gradually became an activist. I started a festival called Clear Lines, which uses the arts and discussion to address sexual assault and consent. And I started my PhD research at the London School of Economics, exploring how rape survivors are engaging with the media as a form of activism. Because none of this is just about my story. In fact, as we know, most victims aren't attacked by a stranger, but by somebody they know, their work colleague, an acquaintance, their family member, their own partner. There are so many of us with these dark chapters, and the process of sharing these stories and being believed or not, and of recovering, is different in every case. So I want to use every angle we can to unearthing the collective truth of all our stories. And in the past year or so, since my book came out, I've spoken at universities and rape crisis centers, at book festivals and the Houses of Parliament, in countries all around the world. And every time I speak, somebody else will come up to me afterwards and say, you know, it happened to me too. So it's time that we listen to survivors and realize that we, are the ones with the shared knowledge and the lived experience which can help us improve the way our public systems handle sexual violence. And instead of casting shame and pity onto survivors, let us honor their truths and their potential, our potential, for positive change. I often think about the childhood me living in New Jersey, reading about Ireland, and I wish I could go back and warn her. Tell her that one day, when she's 29, she'll go on a hike outside of Belfast and her life will never be the same again. But I can't warn her. Some things in life we just can't predict. But I also wouldn't have predicted that when she was 39, in October 2018, she would be invited here to stand on the stage back to Ireland and to share my story with all of you, and in turn to hear so many of your own stories. So storytelling, writing, Ireland, these remain important parts of my life. And I believe you can still be the person you want to be, even in the wake of sexual violence. I believe you can still find your way back and be reunited with your previous dreams and passions. But along the way, you might cross some borders you weren't expecting. Thank you.